Welcome to everything you always wanted to know about Excel, but were afraid to ask. This is Lesson 7, Conditional Formatting. Here's what you'll need for this lesson. Microsoft Excel 2016 or newer, or Excel 365. This lesson's example files. Speakers or headphones. If you can't hear me, you're not learning everything I'm teaching. And ideally, at least 2 monitors. Here's what you'll learn in this class. We'll cover some more logic functions, including the and or functions, the not functions, the switch function, and the exact function. We'll also look at conditional formatting. And finally, we'll look at how to protect and encrypt workbooks and worksheets. A few lessons back, we learned some logic functions, but before we can dive into conditional formatting, we need to learn a couple more basics. Now, logical arguments evaluate to one of 2 Boolean values, either true or false. There are a number of Excel operators and functions that will return a Boolean value, but we're going to focus on a few in particular. The equals function, greater than, less than, does not equal, and the exact function. Most logical arguments are entered just like regular formulas. They start with an equal sign so that Excel will evaluate it as a formula. Then you enter your first value, your operator, and your second value. Excel will either evaluate this as true or false. Now let's look at the exact function. The exact function returns a true or false value, indicating whether 2 arguments are exactly identical. The exact function is case sensitive, while the equals operator is not. The syntax is equals exact, value 1, value 2. Let's look at some examples of some basic logical expressions, just so you can get a little more comfortable writing logical expressions, and we'll use that knowledge a little bit later on in the lesson. So what we've done here is I've got some values and I've got your different operators, and we're just going to practice writing expressions using those so we can see how those true, false, or Boolean values work. Okay, so as I mentioned, every logical expression, just like any other formula or any function, starts with an equal sign, and then we're going to do value 1, and in this column, value 1, and then in this column we're going to do equals, and then value 2. So we're kind of ignoring this first equal sign. That's not part of our logical expression. That's just part of making Excel evaluate it correctly. Okay, so you can see in this case, Excel is always going to return a true or false value here, and you can see it returns a true value where you would expect, where the 2 values are equal, and it works, as I mentioned, with text as well. Now, looking at the greater than operator, again, we start with an equal sign, A3, greater than B3. So in any situation where column 1, the value in column 1 is greater than the value in column 2, then this will evaluate as true. In any situation where it's less than or where it's equal to, the value in column 2, it's going to evaluate as false. And then anything where you can't actually do mathematical comparison, that's going to also evaluate as false. There is no greater than or less than with text values. So it's just going to evaluate as false. This is just a combination. This is a greater than or equal to. So this will be slightly different. Value 1, greater than or equal to. Value 2. So this is just like the previous one, except that we're also including values where the two are equal. So here they're equal. Here they're not. This one's greater than that one, and so that'll evaluate as false still. And then these, because they're equal, are going to evaluate as equal. This is just the reverse. This is less than B3. And again, you can see the only one that evaluates as true is this here, because the value in column 1 is less than the value in column 2. Here we're doing a less than or equal to. So this is A3 is less than or equal to B3. And again, these text values are matching because they're equal. And then all of these are matching because this value is less than or equal to the value in column A. And then finally, we have the does not equal operator. So this is going to return true anytime the two values are not the same, and it's going to return false anytime they are the same. So this is does not equal. So this is essentially the opposite or the reverse of this one, right? Anytime the values are the same, you'll get a true. Or sorry, anytime the values are different, you'll get a true. Anytime they're the same, you'll get false. So with the exact function, you're going to still be comparing as if you were using an equal sign when you're doing any comparison of numeric values. So that's what we're doing here. So for the numeric values, you should get the exact same result, as you can see. But for text values, you're actually going to get a different result because the exact function is case sensitive. So these, while they match using the equals operator, they don't match when you use the exact function. To evaluate more than a single logical argument at once, we use the and or functions. And returns true if all the entered arguments are true. Or returns true if any of the entered arguments is true. The syntax is and, logical 1, logical 2, etc. Or logical 1, logical 2, etc. And or can handle up to 255 arguments each. Let's have a look. So to look at examples of the and or functions, I've set up a couple of different columns here of values, and we're going to just see how those get evaluated. So in this case, we're going to just enter each pair of logical operators as an argument into the AND function. So we're going to look at this value is greater than this value. And then the second one is going to be this value equals this value. And the third one is going to be this value is less than or equal to this value. So now remember, the AND function will return a true if all the arguments are true, and a false if any one of the arguments is false. And here we can see that at least one of them is false. This one is false. This one is also false. If we drag this down, we'll see a couple where it's true. So in this case, this is true. 4,063 is greater than 2,360. 11 does equal 11. And 2 is less than or equal to 6. But if any single one of these things is false, then the AND function is going to return false. The OR function is different. The OR function will return true if any of the arguments are true. So again, looking at this same row of arguments, we have this greater than this. We have this equals this. And we have this is less than or equal to this. So now we can see here, we know this is false, and we know this is false. But this one here is true. 9 is less than or equal to 9. And so this will evaluate as true. The only ones that evaluate as false are the ones where all three arguments are false. So that's this is false, and this is false, and this is false. The NOT function reverses the true-false value of its input. The syntax is not logical. The function accepts either a true-false value or any expression that would evaluate to a true-false value. The NOT function just reverses whichever true-false value is input into it. So it only takes one argument, and that can be a cell reference. So in this case, for example, if we want to reverse all of these, we would put them in a NOT function, and you can see it just reverses whatever value is input. You can also nest a function in there. So for example, so this is essentially the AND function that we have over here, but I've gone ahead and nested it directly in the NOT function, and you can see it's the same as if I had just referenced this directly. You can also put a logical expression directly in here. 1 equals 2, for example. We know that that's not true, so this is going to return true. Or 1 equals 1, which we know is true, and that will return false. And finally, you can just put a logical value directly in here. So not true will return false, and vice versa. the switch function evaluates an input against a list of values and returns a result corresponding to the first match. This is a pretty complicated one. The syntax is equals switch, the expression, value 1, result 1, value 2, result 2, etc., and then a default. This works similarly to a case statement in many programming languages if you're familiar with any types of programming. Let's have a look at each of these arguments before we dive into a demo. So first we have the expression. This is the input to evaluate against a list of possible values. Then we have the values. This is a possible value for the expression. Next we have a result. This is the value to return when the expression matches the corresponding value. And finally, we can provide a default. And this is the value to return if the expression doesn't match any of the given values. All right, now let's have a look at how this works. A couple lessons back, we looked at the weekday function, and that, you may recall, returns a number 1 through 7 corresponding to the day of the week. We went ahead and nested those inside a VLOOKUP to reference a range of values. But what we can do now with the switch function is, instead of referencing outside data, we can return a value based on how this returns without using a lookup table. So we're going to just wrap our weekday function in a switch function. The weekday function is standing in for the expression. Remember, that's going to return a 1 through 7. So we want to supply what those options are. If it returns a 1, we're going to say if it returns a 2, maybe we'll say and so on. I saved myself the trouble of some typing there by writing those in advance for you. So that's the idea, is rather than using an outside table, we can just use the switch function because it's a fairly small set of values. It may not be worth having outside reference data. Another thing we can do with the switch function is, again, we're going to use the weekday function as our input. But maybe we just want to know whether this is a weekend or a weekday. So if it returns a 1, that's our value 1, then we're going to say it's a weekend because that's a Sunday. We know that. And if it returns a 7, which is a Saturday, we're going to say it's a weekend. But we're not going to enumerate all the other days. We're just going to provide a default value at the end here. If it's not a Saturday or a Sunday, we know it's a weekday. So the default input, which is the last input, anything we don't pair with an input value, allows us to just say, here's all the rest, basically. What is conditional formatting? Conditional formatting is an Excel feature that helps answer specific questions about your data. Conditional formatting can apply any cell-level formatting based on a condition or a logical test. If the condition is true, the formatting rule is applied, and if the condition is false, the formatting rule is not applied. Conditional formatting is used to highlight relevant cells, making the data you care about most stand out. Let's look at the different types of conditional formatting. We can format cells based on their values or a range of values. We can highlight top or bottom values. We can also apply visual aids, including data bars, color scales, or icon sets. We can highlight unique or duplicate values. And we can format based on a formula. To add conditional formatting, select one of the preset formats from the drop-down button on the Home tab. To create a custom rule, select New Rule. And to edit or prioritize existing rules, select Manage Rules. For our first example of conditional formatting, we're going to look at how to highlight top and bottom values. And so for that, we have this on the Q1 Sales tab here. We have some favorite Disney characters working as sales associates. And we have our January, February, and March, as well as our total quarterly sales. So in order to apply some logic that shows who our top performers are, we're going to simply select the cells that we want to apply this formatting to. So let's look at just January. And we want to see who our top selling, our top salespeople in January were. So on the Home tab, in the Styles section, we have a conditional formatting button. Go ahead and click that. And the very first option is Highlight Cells Rules. Now, there's a whole lot of different options, and we're not going to have time to go into all of them today, but I'm going to go into some of the most common ones that you might find useful. So we're actually looking at top and bottom rules. And let's look at the top 10 items. So this is going to just highlight the top 10 numbers here. Now, since this is sales and high numbers are good, I think we probably want something a little bit, we don't want this red. I usually like to go with the green fill. I think that's got a nice look to it. But you can also choose custom format, and it'll pop up your formatting dialog box, and you can just select what colors you want and all of that. We're going to go with this. This is the top 10 sellers in January, and it's going to just highlight the top 10 values. That can be very useful for easily tracking this data. If you look at this, it's kind of a jumble of numbers. Without going line by line, it would be very hard to do this analysis to be able to say, like, okay, well, who did the best? You can sort by it, obviously, or use a rank function, but this allows you to just highlight it in place like that without any manual work. You can also choose to highlight, instead of the top 10 items, you could highlight the top 10% of salespeople. So again, in this case, there's less than 100 names here, so it's going to be fewer. But these are your top 2 sellers in January. Now, in both of those cases, you can also apply that same logic to your bottom 10 sellers or bottom 10% of sellers. So in this case, we want to see who our best sellers are, and we want to see who our worst salespeople are for the month, who's not quite pulling their weight. And you can apply both of those to that same set of cells. You can also adjust, in this case, I stuck with 10, but let's just look at the bottom 5, for example. And you can see, who had the lowest sales and who had the higher sales for the month. Sometimes top and bottom isn't what you're looking for. Maybe you just want to see who did above average, who did better than the median. And that's also in here. You can also do just highlight the people who did really well, because that may not be a specific number of people. Things can skew the median. So So that's also a really good way of saying, like, hey, these are our good performers. Like, let's not put a number limit on it necessarily. Now, just looking at the same data, I'm going to show you how to do some of the conditional formatting icons. So here I've added a couple of columns representing month-over-month growth for these salespeople. So February over January, and then March over February. And we're going to apply another type of conditional formatting here. So the conditional formatting, one of the options is these icon sets. And there's a bunch of different ones. You know, take your pick. These are all roughly do the same thing. I'm a big fan of this. So this tells you, you know, how people are doing overall. Now it bases it on percentiles by default, and I don't like that. I would like to say that anyone who has more than 200% growth month over month was probably doing pretty well. The average was 351% growth, I guess. So what I'm going to do is go into Manage Rules, and you can see our rule that we set here. I'm just going to double click on that. And I'm going to modify what these values are. I can also modify which icons are used here, or which icon set we use. But I'm going to stick with the arrows, and I'm going to change these. This is basically if they're in the 67th percentile, then it's an up arrow. Otherwise, it's a sideways or down arrow. I'm going to say that anybody over 350% is doing a pretty good job here, and anyone over 125% is doing a pretty decent job, and then anything under that is kind of doing a not great job. So let's just do that. So I can adjust my scale appropriately and apply those changes, and now we have that. So this one outlier at 1900% growth isn't dragging kind of everyone else down into a, you know, not great. Moving on to our next tab, the Oscar Prediction Tracker tab. So what this data represents, these are my Oscar predictions going back as far as 1998. And it's whether I got my prediction right or wrong in each category for that year. This is real data. You know, so what's the problem with this data? Besides that it gives away just how extremely nerdy I am, is that it's pretty hard to read, right? It's a single letter in a spreadsheet. The info we're interested in isn't really standing out the way we'd like it to. So the solution for that is some conditional formatting to make the interesting data stand out. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to Highlight Cell Rules, and we're going to choose Text that Contains. And in this case, it tried to automatically highlight N for us. I think I'd rather focus on the positive and highlight the yeses. Let's look at the things I got right, not the things I got wrong. So you can just type whatever text you want in here, and it's going to highlight that. in whatever formatting you choose. And in this case, you can see, there are some years where I did pretty well. There are some years where I did relatively poorly. All in all, I probably beat the average a little bit, I would guess. One thing that is worth noting that we haven't talked about in this class yet is, as I've been kind of scrolling back and forth on this data, now that we're dealing with larger amounts of data, as we get better at analyzing that data, we're going to be dealing with larger amounts of data. And one of the pitfalls of that is we've got our row headers here and our column headers up here, and it's particularly hard as we scroll to know exactly what we're looking at. So what I like to do in these situations is on the View tab, there's a Freeze Panes button that allows you to freeze the top row or the first column, or in this case, because we want to kind of do both, it allows you to select a cell and freeze everything above and to the left of that. So we're going to do that real quick. That allows me to scroll this way and not lose my years at the top, or to scroll this way and not lose my categories over here, which is going to come in very handy in a second. So now that we've got kind of an easier thing to digest, we can see that this data is a little more interesting than it was a moment ago. But we can't yet quite quantify that. It's still, I can look at this and go, okay, this was a good year, I guess. This was a bad year over here. But one thing that can help us kind of quantify that are the conditional formatting color scales. And so we're going to look at those. First, we're going to look at them on an annualized basis here. So I've got the number of correct predictions each year, and I've got the percent of predictions that I got right for each year. And that's important because there were different numbers of categories back when I started. And also, I didn't used to make predictions in these categories, apparently. So what a fool I was in 1998. So the way a color scale works is you apply it to a range of cells, once again, and you go to conditional formatting, color scales, and there's some different options. You can go ahead and set your own color scale, but I find that these usually work out pretty well for me. And depending on whether high numbers are good or high numbers are bad, I usually kind of stay in these areas here, but obviously there's plenty of other options as well. So we're going to just apply this very first option here, the green, yellow, red color scale. The way that works is basically the best numbers are the darkest green, and the highest numbers are the darkest green, and the lowest numbers are the darkest red, and everything is kind of a gradient in between. So you can see like these years, 42, 43%, that's not a very good total. I did not win my Oscar pool those years. And you can also see this total in 2013, which I will never beat. And it's also the year that we had an Oscar pool at work, and we never had one again because everyone was just so mad at me for getting 22 out of 24 categories correct. So I ruined the Oscar pool all at once. But these are my, this is pretty good. You can see, I've stayed in the mostly greenish stages. Last year, 2 years ago, this was a pretty bad year. I didn't get very many right, especially in like big categories, I guess. So that's what we can learn from this data. We can also apply the same type of color scale over here based on the percent of times that I got a particular category correct in my Oscar predictions. So once again, we can look at some color scales. Maybe stick with a green to yellow scale this time, just so I don't feel as embarrassed as I otherwise could by this here. And you can see that of these, I do pretty well in the score category and the production design category, and it's best supporting actor. Not so well in the short films. I think like anybody else. I don't think anybody does well in those categories. Moving on to the next tab, this is the concerts tab here. You may recognize this data from lesson 1. This is the list of every concert that I've ever been to. And we're going to use this to demonstrate a couple more things that we can do here. So another type of conditional formatting that we can apply to this data is we can highlight duplicate values. So in conditional formatting, under highlight cell rules, we can highlight duplicate values. So these are obviously concerts where I liked the person enough the first time to go see them a second time. So these are probably some of my more favorite performers here. And that allows us to see who is in this list more than one. Another thing we can do is look at the unique values within a range. They say variety is the spice of life, and so let's look at which venues have I only been to one time. Under highlight rules, under highlight cell rules here, we'd select duplicate values again, but we can choose in this case to, in the drop down here, we can choose unique instead of duplicate. And now we can see all of the values that are not duplicated within this list. And finally, a thing that we can do with conditional formatting is we can write our own conditional formatting from scratch, basically. So the way we're going to do that here is I'm actually going to select this column. We're going to click conditional formatting and new rule. And this brings up the new formatting rule dialog box. And what we're talking about here is the use a formula to determine which cells to format. Now, a few things you need to know about this. First of all, the way it works is you write a formula, use whatever functions and formulas and operators you want here, and for any cell where that formula evaluates as true, the formatting will be applied. And for any cell where the formula evaluates as false, the formatting will not be applied. And so now you see how this ties into our revisiting and expanding of logic functions earlier in this lesson. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that this place where you can write your functions is not great. It's pretty annoying to deal with. You don't get all of your prompts that you're used to getting when you're writing something in Excel proper. If you make a mistake and you want to go back and fix it, you have to use your mouse to do it, because if you try and use your arrow keys at all, you end up making a mess of things because it just goes around here. So that's not helpful. One thing that you might want to consider doing, especially until you get comfortable with this, is just writing your formula over here. Just write it somewhere in your spreadsheet. And then copying it into your format formula. Okay, so what this will do is look at each cell and evaluate whether it is equals y. And if it does, it will apply the formatting. So what I've done is marked some of my favorite concerts with Y's. And what I really want to do is actually apply this formatting across this whole across the whole row. I want to highlight the entire row for my favorite concerts and for my least favorite concerts. So this formatting is a little bit tricky when it comes to doing that, but essentially what you can do, and the way I like to do it, is to write the rule for one cell or one column essentially, and then go ahead and apply it to the rest of the columns. So in this case, we started with this cell, G2. And as we apply this across, we want the row to change, but we want the column to stay there. So we're going to go ahead and just make that a mixed reference. And then we can apply it to A2 through G49. Hopefully that will work. There we go. And you can see that works. So it's important to note, as you can see, that you can apply multiple rules to the same area, and it's important to understand kind of how those rules play off of each other when you do. So you can see here, these cells were part of this rule, the duplicates rule, but the new rule that we added, the highlight favorites rule, that's kind of overruled it. Maybe that's what we wanted, but maybe it isn't. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that we didn't want to override the other rule. We can go into conditional formatting and click Manage Rules. And you can see that the reason that this overrode the other one is that the new rule got applied first. It was put on top here. So we could swap that if we wanted. We could select this rule and say, actually, we want to apply this one first, the duplicate values rule. And if I hit apply, you'll see that it goes back to being highlighted in that light green color. Now, the reason these rules conflict with each other is because they both apply to the same formatting types. They both change the background color and the text color of the cell, and as a result, only one of them can apply. But the second rule, the favorites rule, highlight favorites rule, bolds things. It bolds the text, and the first rule doesn't deal with anything bold or anything like that. And as a result, you can see that both rules are applying here. The text is still being bolded. Again, maybe that's what we want, but if it's not, if we only want to apply this rule, and then if it's true, not apply any other rules? Well, that's an option. We have the stop if true column here. And what that does is if this rule evaluates as true, and I've selected stop if true, it's not even going to look at the other rules. So I've checked that box, and you can see it got rid of the bolding around those. You can see it's still bolding the Webster Theater here. And so that's how we deal with rules that conflict. Obviously, another option is writing a more complex formula if you want to incorporate more than one rule into your decision making. You can write a more complex formula that does take into account whether there are duplicate values or what have you, but it's just important to know that you can kind of swap these around as you see fit, and that the order of these does affect the ultimate outcome. Whenever you're distributing your workbook to others, you may want to take certain precautions, including locking the cells to prevent unauthorized changes, hiding the formulas, protecting the worksheet from unauthorized changes, protecting the workbook structure from changes, or password encrypting the workbook to prevent unauthorized access. Let's take a look at how all of that works. So when you're distributing your spreadsheet, it is important to spend some time thinking about usability and security. For usability purposes, you basically just don't want anyone to accidentally make changes that will affect your formulas or whatever else you have in your spreadsheet. For security, you don't want people to access things that they don't need access to or that they shouldn't have access to. So we're going to go over the different ways to kind of lock down your spreadsheet so that we don't have to worry so much about these particular concerns. So the first thing we're going to talk about is locking cells. Now, by default, when you start a new spreadsheet, all cells are locked technically, but locking doesn't have any effect on its own, and we'll see what it actually does. But the way to set whether a cell is locked is to select a cell. So we're going to go ahead and select all the cells in this case, and then right-click and open up the Format Cells dialog. And all the way on the end here is the Protection tab. So if you click the Protection tab, you're going to see two options, Locked and Hidden. We're going to start by talking about Locked. So I'm going to lock all of these cells. And as I mentioned, it doesn't have any effect currently. I can still type in all of these cells. I can still do kind of whatever I want. That's going to change in a minute. But for right now, I can, there's really no difference between locked cells and unlocked cells. So I've gone ahead and locked all of these cells. And I'm going to I want to unlock these. And you'll see why in a few moments. But I'm going to go in here. You can see they're locked. I'm going to unlock them and hit OK. You won't notice any change. Again, I can still do whatever I want here. This isn't going to have any effect until I protect my worksheet. So I'm going to do that now, and we'll talk a little bit more about protecting worksheets in a minute. But I just want to show what the locking does. Okay, so now I have locked my worksheet. And we have these unprotected cells, and we have these protected cells. Well, I just want to delete all of this data. When I click delete, I can't do it because I'm trying to change locked cells. I can't type anything in these cells or in any of the cells that I've locked. So that's the effect that locking has once you've protected a spreadsheet. These are unlocked, so I can still change these. And you know, I can make all the changes I want to the unlocked cells, but the locked cells, I can't do anything. I'm going to get that error. So that's what happens. That's the difference between locked cells and unlocked cells. The second thing that we mentioned as a method of locking down your spreadsheet is hiding formulas. So, you know, there's nothing proprietary about any of these formulas that I've written here, unless you haven't watched the previous lesson and haven't figured out how to write these yet. But let's say there were some trade secrets in here, or we just don't want the people who have access to this spreadsheet to be able to see what the underlying data, how the underlying data is evaluated in these formulas. So we have that ability too. It's in the same spot. We're going to hit Format Cells, and we're going to click Hidden. And again, selecting Hidden here has no effect whatsoever until we protect the worksheet. So again, I'm going to do that. And now you can see, again, I can still see everything here. These are unprotected, unhidden cells. I can still change this back to Robert Downey Jr. But what I can't do is see what these formulas are. So now not only can I not edit these, but I can no longer see what the formulas underlying them are. Okay, so now it's time to talk about protecting worksheets. So protecting a worksheet, in addition to allowing you to make some cells uneditable or make some formulas hidden, it allows you a whole bunch of other bits of control over your spreadsheet. To protect a worksheet, you can right-click the tab and select Protect Sheet. And it's going to bring up this Protect Sheet dialog box. Now, there's going to be a whole bunch of options here that let you decide, while the sheet is protected, what users are and are not allowed to do. And there's a whole bunch of them. I'm going to talk about a few of them. You can allow users to select locked cells. So you saw, even though I couldn't edit those cells before, I was able to click on them. If I uncheck this box and then protect the worksheet, I won't even be able to select any of these cells. I can only select the unlocked cells. If you have people filling in a form or something like that, this can be a very useful setting to have. Otherwise, it's probably overkill. You almost never will want to uncheck the select unlocked cells. You want people to have this ability. Otherwise, they can't really interact with your spreadsheet at all. By default, these are the two that are checked. These are the two permissions that are allowed for people, even when your spreadsheet is locked. But you can give them the ability to format cells, columns, rows, insert columns and rows, add hyperlinks, delete columns and rows. This one is dicey. I don't think I've ever locked a spreadsheet but still given people the ability to delete columns and rows. You can allow them to sort or use filter. This one is pretty common. You can allow them to add pivot tables and pivot charts, which we'll talk about in a future lesson, and edit objects and scenarios, which we probably won't talk about in a future lesson. So these are the different options. In addition to locking down your spreadsheet, which is probably sufficient in most cases, if you're just trying to prevent people from accidentally screwing stuff up, locking it down, probably don't need to set a password on it. But if you're trying to prevent malicious abuse or corporate espionage or something like that, you can add a password, and that password will be required to unprotect the sheet. Just note that there's no way of recovering the password. So if you forget your password, you won't be able to unlock the sheet. You'll just have to start back from scratch. So if we type in a password, it will ask me to re-enter the password, which is good because these passwords cannot be recovered. And now, again, I've protected this spreadsheet, and if I try to unprotect it, it's going to prompt me for my password before I can do that. So it's important to be judicious about whether or not you need a password. Again, if I'm distributing something within my department and there's nothing super secret within it, locking it down just so people don't accidentally break it is usually sufficient. If it's being distributed outside my department, outside my company, if there's proprietary information in there, if there's anything that can affect people's usage, if they could see the formulas or whatever, then you want to password protect it, just to make sure no one is going to be able to do any damage to it. In addition to protecting individual worksheets, you can also protect the structure of your workbook as a whole. To do that, click on the File tab, and right here where it says Protect Workbook, you can protect the workbook structure. And so what that does is allows you to prevent people from adding or removing additional worksheets. And again, this allows you the ability to add a password for the to unprotect it. So if I try to unprotect the workbook structure, then it will prompt me for that password. Now, besides just protecting the structure of a workbook or the contents and structure of a worksheet, you may want to restrict access to the spreadsheet itself. For that, we have an option to encrypt our workbook with a password. So to do that, we go to File, and then in the same drop down here, we have the Encrypt with a Password option. So this is going to require a password to be entered just to open your spreadsheet. And this works the same as the other password options in that there is no way to recover this password if you lose it. So make sure it's something you know, or make sure you have it saved in your password manager or whatever. But if you encrypt your spreadsheet, you won't be able to recover that password. So let's go ahead and close this and just see how that works. Okay, so we've got our example files here, and when I try to open it, you'll see it launches Excel, and it immediately prompts me for a password. So users who don't have the password, not only will they not be able to open your document, they won't be able to see anything about your document. They won't be able to see what worksheets you have or anything like that. So it's the most secure way of distributing data that might be proprietary or otherwise confidential. And you can remove a password simply by clicking encrypt with password again and removing the password. Let's recap what we learned today. We learned some new logic functions, including and or, not, switch, and exact. We learned several different types of conditional formatting, and we learned about how to protect and encrypt workbooks and worksheets. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and we'll see you next time.